Did you know there are 289 days until Father's Day? I just thought I'd make you aware. On this edition of the show, we talk about the mayor's race. We talk about the presidential election. Specific to the mayor's race, where's the money? With the presidential election, who's got the juice? Let's chat about it. Roll it, Kurt. So here we are in front of the touchscreen. John Couvion, Win with JMC. There's a website right there, brother. WinWithJMC.com. Let's talk a little presidential election. All right, going to the touchscreen, which I love this, by the way.
Yes.
RealClearPolitics.com builds a composite of these major polls that reflect where the candidates, the two candidates, Harris and Trump, are right now. This is fascinating. Tell me what your initial thoughts are on these numbers.
The one number on the screen that to me overpowers everything else, you could look at the average, which shows that Kamala Harris as of today is ahead 1.7 percentage points. However, the more salient number in my opinion is this one. So in other words, on this point in time in 2020, Joe Biden was ahead 6.9%. What that means is that Trump is actually running 5 points ahead of where he was 4 years ago. And I'm of the opinion that there is some of the Trump vote which flies below radar and does not get captured by polls. So 1.7% deficit is not the curtains for Donald Trump for the reason that, number one, at this point in time, Joe Biden was 5 points further ahead. Number two, the fact that with the Electoral College, because the Democratic vote is so top-heavy in places like California, New York, Illinois, and so forth, that enables you to run up the score on the national popular vote, but you do not get any extra electoral votes by winning Illinois with 60% versus 55%. So where I'm going with this, to put this in what I call Louisiana English, is that, it's my favorite term I use on social media, to use Louisiana English, I'm of the opinion that if a Harris lead is less than 2.5% to 3%, Donald Trump can win with 270 plus electoral votes, and that's what elects presidents, not the national popular vote.
Well, yeah, because it's not about the popular number. We've seen people win the popular vote but lose the electoral number and don't win the office. Where they are right now is interesting because she's polling ahead.
Yes.
I told you this before we started. It's one of the most fascinating political stories I've seen in some time. The Kamala Harris story.
Right.
4 months ago, she was nowhere on the scene. Joe Biden was going to be the candidate. You didn't really see her a lot. And now she's on the precipice of becoming the next president of the United States.
And the thing that's fascinating about that is when you think that because of her association with the Biden administration, you would have thought she's dead in the water. But in my opinion, the Trump-Vance ticket has wasted time worrying about things like her race and her cackling and so forth, when all you have to do is say that Kamala Harris is part of the Joe Biden administration. In other words, that is a more effective line of attack than getting into the racial stuff, which is very unproductive.
The name calling, he's more attractive than she is. And it's like, come on, what are we talking about here? It's like the issues really aren't being talked about. What about this debate? What's at stake for him and her in the debate?
A lot. So basically what's happened is this, to give you the 50,000 foot blow by blow, a Donald Trump lead of about 3%, which occurred after the attempted assassination and the Republican convention, steadily became a Kamala Harris lead, according to my poll average of 2 points. At a 2 point lead, Donald Trump can still win. The key is he cannot allow further sliding. And what's important about the debate is, being that it is on September 10th, that to me has the potential of moving things a point or two.
Right.
And by the way, on September 10th, North Carolina is already mail-in voting. 10 days after that, which is September 20th, Illinois, South Dakota, and Minnesota start in-person early voting. So where I'm going with this is the election season is going to start relatively fast. And as if that weren't head-turning enough, I calculated that by October 8th, states totaling 270 electoral votes will already have their voting underway.
Well, they're in Georgia right now, and there's a big deal because Biden won Georgia 4 years ago, and it's up for grabs, and they're there. That's an important state in terms of the electoral number.
It is. And the important thing, too, when you're talking about the states starting their voting, is there's going to be less mail-in voting this year than there was in 2020 for two reasons. Number one, the pandemic and government mandates kind of forced more mail-in voting on people. Number two, if you don't have to vote by mail, it's much harder to have the motivation to get up and go to the polling place as opposed to a mail ballot being on your table that your guilty conscience tells you have to vote. I noticed in Florida, and they just completed their primary, mail-in voting took a tumble relative to 2020, no big surprise there, but was a surprise. There was not a corresponding number of mail-in voters choosing to vote on election day. What that means in plain terms, or to use my Louisiana English example again, I'm of the opinion that there's going to be a lower turnout than 165 million.
The fact that we're still doing mail ballots in 2024 is so interesting. Something else that's interesting is the mayor's race. Coming up, we're going to talk about where this stands and what the money looks like. We'll do that next. So the mayor's race is at the top of the ticket locally here. However, it's not as sizzling as the national thing, but it's still interesting nonetheless. You and I talked a few weeks ago, about 4 years ago, where Mayor President Sharon Weston Broome stood with other candidates in that race. I had actually forgotten Eric Gerard was a candidate when the election happened 4 years ago. The first question is she as strong now as she was 4 years ago?
I would say she's not, because she's, basically since she was reelected, you of course had the pandemic, there's been an uptick in crime, homelessness, and so forth. And she has a credible challenger in Ted James. So the thing that you have to appreciate when kind of handicapping how the primary is going to go is you have to remember that starting in 2012, the mayor-president's race occurred at the same time as the presidential election. So what that means is you have a pretty strong partisan undercurrent occurring. So more specifically, if you were to look at the 2020 numbers, you could see, well, look, Mayor-President Sharon Weston Broome was pushed to a runoff with 48%. However, the more important number was...
Well, hang on. If Representative Marcel were not in this race, I think those votes would have gone to Broome, right?
And that's the part about the presidential and the mayor-president's race being closely tied together. Because 48% versus looking at the Biden-Trump numbers, which was 56-42. And by the way, that 56% is almost exactly equal to the sum total of what Mayor Broome and Representative Denise Marcel got. Therefore, the one-to-one correspondence. So taking that concept and applying it to 2024, what you have to realize, you're probably going to have numbers very similar to this, where you basically promote Kamala Harris to president now. Trump is still there. So imagine Sharon Weston Broome and Ted James splitting that 56% of the vote. Ted James also has to get a chunk of that 42%. In other words, he has to have a foot in both camps to possibly make the runoff. What's going to get tricky about that is you have several Republicans running, one of whom is Coach Sid Edwards, who I'm of the opinion he's going to get, as the first Republican alphabetically on the ballot, a decent share of that 42% Trump vote. So he and Ted James, in my opinion, are going to be fighting for that second place spot, whereas Mayor Broome has the easiest task of all, which is she could basically just sit on her base, ride it out to December.
Because she's going to be number one no matter what happens between Sid Edwards and Ted James after November, right?
And by the way, if she does not run first, I would think that would be terrible for her in terms of her chances in December. You remember a similar thing happened back in 1987 when Edwin Edwards was running second and he immediately dropped out.
But in what reality would she not run first?
A very limited reality, because she is an incumbent mayor. She's a Democrat. She has Kamala Harris on the ballot with her, which is going to bring an elevated turnout. I don't see how she could miss making the runoff.
So between Ted James and Sid Edwards, Sid's going to pull a big chunk, basically most of the Republican vote. He is going to pull some black Democrat vote because of his popularity as having been a football coach. And then there's Ted James, who's popular. If you're Ted James, what would you advise him to do in terms of messaging right now?
If I were Ted James, I would basically tell him to do the Troy Carter strategy, which is basically you've got to have a foot in both camps, which is you need to get a respectable number of Republican votes. You also need to get a respectable number of white liberal and or black Democratic votes.
So here is one thing working in his favor. Dude's got a ton of money in the bank. Over $625,000 in his war chest. Pretty impressive as a candidate who's running for an office like this kind of office for the first time. This is the only time he's ever run for an executive branch office. He's been in the state legislature, and of course he was a Biden appointee. But to what do you attribute all this money, man?
Basically, you have two things going on in the political world. You have what I call the donor primary, and then you have the actual primary where voters chime in. This is a donor primary action. In other words, he has basically marketed himself to the power players here in town. He's raised a ton of money doing so, and that's what gives him this really good number. And by the way, the thing you have to appreciate when you're talking about having 600,000 on hand, which is basically congressional level numbers,
Yes.
is that, you know the old saying, you don't have a second chance to make a first impression?
Yeah.
The next finance report does not come out until October. So if you're the average political handicapper, the only thing you have to look at is, well, let's see, Ted James has raised over, or rather he has over $600,000 on hand. Mayor Broome has approximately $400,000 on hand.
Yeah.
None of the other candidates have more than $10,000. And what's unfair about it, but life is what it is, even if you were to raise several $100,000 between now and early October, the average donor is just going to look at this finance report, which is the only thing out there right now.
He's almost doubled her up on
Correct.
numbers. She's an incumbent.
Yes.
How? Like, how could he have so much more?
I think that there's probably several things going on. Number one, those with large checkbooks very much do not want the mayor to get reelected, and so they are donating hand over fist to Ted James. Number two, perhaps Mayor Broome has not been aggressive enough in her fundraising. Number three, perhaps she's been spending more of it. All those kinds of variables can come to play.
WinWithJMC.com. You'll see him again in a few weeks as we get closer to the election. Appreciate you, brother.
Always.
Johnny Dunham's joining us next. Well, he's a former chief of the Baton Rouge Police Department and now the executive director of the Capital Region Crime Stoppers. Most of you know about Crime Stoppers. You've heard about the stories for years. He replaced Sid Newman, who was there for 114 years as the lead in Crime Stoppers. So, you know, people see Crime Stoppers stories here on AFB and read about, you know, the most wanteds. But on a day-to-day basis, could you tell people what Crime Stoppers does?
Yeah, you know, Crime Stoppers is a nonprofit, but we are embedded in law enforcement. And the concept of an anonymous tip line came about back in the early 70s. There was an incident, a homicide that happened in Albuquerque, New Mexico, of a young man, and the detective working the case couldn't get a break in the case, and he was looking for a way to accept anonymous tips and pay cash rewards for those tips. And that's kind of where Crime Stoppers started in the 80s, early 80s. Young detective Sid Newman, who was a homicide detective, and Pat Bonanno was the chief at the time, asked Sid to go look into this anonymous tip line that was being used at other agencies across the country. And Sid went, investigated, brought the concept back to Baton Rouge of having a nonprofit to be able to pay these rewards for tips. And in 1982, Baton Rouge Crime Stoppers was formed with business leaders across the city. And it's been in existence, like I said, since 1982, so 42 years.
So let's talk, how many payments have you, or rewards dollars have y'all given out?
Yeah, we've given out almost $2.5 million in rewards in that 42 years. We average anywhere from about $75,000 to $100,000 a year in rewards for tips.
And people wonder about it. You and I have had the conversation. It is definitely anonymous.
Completely anonymous. When somebody calls, they can call in at 344-STOP. Everybody's heard 344-STOP. They can go on our website at crimestoppers225.com and click on the submit a tip, or they can, there's a P3 app. We have an app. It's P3 kind of runs the software for all the Crime Stoppers across the country and some parts of the world as well. But they can submit tips that way. They will never ask for your name. We don't want to know your name.
Right.
And they're assigned a code number. When they get that code number, we'll ask them, you know, once they give us the information, we'll ask them to call back in a week or two, or, you know, check back online in a week or two with their code number. We'll give the tip to the detectives. We are embedded in law enforcement, so we work in the violent crime unit at the state police, where BRPD's homicide division is. The Sheriff's Office Homicide Division and Major Assaults Divisions are. So we're right down the hall. When we get a tip, Don Coppola, who's my law enforcement coordinator, Lieutenant Don Coppola, and Brandy Alford is our crime information specialist. They'll take the tip, they'll give it to the detective, whichever detective may be working the case where the information is valuable. And then we'll ask the individuals to call us back in a couple of weeks. If the tip pans out and we've made an arrest on that tip, we'll schedule for payment. And we schedule at a local area bank once a month for payment.
So we got about a minute. Have you seen and we'll come back and continue with Chief Dunham, have you seen a drop off in the number of tips that you get in the last few years?
Yeah, no, actually we've seen an increase, about a 20% increase in the number of tips. You know, the public, and crime it fluctuates. You know, you have ebbs and flows to crime, and you know, had an increase in crime last year.
Yeah.
But we've noticed as the increase, we get increases in tips. Yeah. And you know, crime is starting to go back down again, and but we still see that increase. The public, you know, we couldn't do it. The police couldn't do it alone. They have to have the public's help, and you know, Crime Stop is that avenue for the public to help without the fear of retaliation and you know, the added benefit of a cash reward.
So we'll come back and talk with Chief Dunham a little bit more about Crime Stoppers, but also about the Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice Foundation. We both serve on the board. We had a pretty big event earlier this week, and we're kicking off the construction of the Inspiration Center next week.
Yep.
Thank goodness. So we'll come back and talk with him. And on the next edition of the C-Suite, Paul Rice, the father of Allie Rice, will be on the show to talk about who Allie was and explain the day that changed his life forever. That's the next edition of the C-Suite. Back with Chief Dunham. Before we transition, one more question about Crime Stoppers, and that is, where do you see it going over the next few years under your leadership?
Yeah, no, I mean, we hope to increase the number of tips, increase the number of payouts, because as long as we're increasing the number of payouts, that means we're solving crime, you know, and there's still a lot of unsolved homicides that have happened in Baton Rouge. You know, Liz Robinson's son, Allie Rice, Devin
Page,
Devin Page as well. So there are a lot of unsolved homicides in Baton Rouge that we would love to get solved.
Those are three high-profile ones, especially because we have this initiative, the Page Rice Public Safety Initiative, named after Devin Page Jr. and Allison Rice, and we're going to talk about the foundation in just a moment. But man, it's just hard to think about something like that happening and no one knowing anything.
Yeah, somebody out there knows. You know, we would hope that they'd pick up the phone and call us. They've heard somebody talk about it, and it's just could be just a small piece of information that they have that might refresh their memory. And we would hope that they would call, go on the website, and submit a tip. You know,
yeah,
we'd love to get those homicides solved.
People have information, they would help these families. Talking about Devin and Allie, the Page Rice Public Safety Initiative is an initiative of the Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice Foundation, and you and I both serve on the board on that thing, and we're about 3.5 years old. We announced the closing ceremony, or the closing phase of funding for the Inspiration Center, which we start construction on next week. So when you and now Deputy Chief Noel and now Deputy Chief Clarida, and we were all talking about doing this, did you ever think we'd be at this point?
I never thought we'd be at this point. And I got to give all of the credit. I can tell you, when we initially thought of the concept of a nonprofit, law enforcement nonprofit, we were thinking as police officers, we were thinking enforcement aspect of it. We weren't really thinking, because crime is multifaceted. The reasons for crime, education, there's just so many other factors that factor into crime. And we were thinking enforcement the entire time. And what can we do because at the time, this was after, the floods and all the issues that we had in 2016 and 2017. The public was reaching out a great deal on how to help the police department with funding to kind of, our budget didn't always pay for cameras for the real-time crime center. It didn't pay for the technology that we needed to kind of offset or leverage our manpower shortages. And we had thought about it maybe being, because we couldn't accept funding from the general public. We needed a nonprofit avenue to kind of help filter that funding. and we talked to you about it. And when you
threw me under the bus,
yeah,
we
did kind of throw you under the bus, and we talked to you about it, and then just it's amazing what's happened in 3 years,
Yeah.
and the foresight that you had, that Colonel Davis had, that Angel Nelson's had, as far as the education and the training aspect for the kids, has really made the Law Enforcement Foundation what it is today.
Man, I'm so glad you guys wanted to do it. And again, you can see there was some video from the closing reception we had earlier this week talking about that. But, like we've always said, we have to support enforcement. We've purchased vests. We've spent over $1 million on crime cameras, license plate readers. We have weapons detection software. We're sponsoring the National Canine Trials that are coming to Baton Rouge in a couple of months. But we wanted to balance enforcement, and that's where the Inspiration Center came along. I mean, brother, can you imagine we've raised $15 million in 2 years.
It's unheard of. I've never heard of a nonprofit raising that kind of money. And going and visiting St. Cloud, Minnesota, the cop houses there.
Flew on my first private jet going there.
Yes,
Johnny told me, said I'm ruined.
I'm ruined. I was completely ruined from commercial flights again after flying private to St. Cloud, Minnesota. Yeah, that was a nice.
We did that. We did Atlanta, and then next week there's going to be a press conference. Alyssa's wrapping me up. 30 seconds. And next week press conference talking about the national investment in Baton Rouge. We'll have more details there. Chief's going to be speaking at that press conference as well, talking about these banks.
Absolutely.
3 big firms who've put money in Baton Rouge and specifically in North Baton Rouge, brother.
And it will make a difference.
It will make a difference.
It is going to make a huge difference.
We've seen it. Lower recidivism, lower truancy rates, better access to service. All of that's going to be inside of the Inspiration Center. 25,000 square feet, indoor basketball gym, video game arena, computer labs, full kitchen, the whole 9, and it's going to be paid for when it opens.
That's it.
That's how we do it.
It's amazing.
All right, see y'all next week.
All right.